Welcome to Calgary Speaks, Calgarians Perceptions on Crime, Justice, and Crime Prevention. In the spirit of reconciliation, we would like to start by acknowledging that we gathered here today on the territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Siksika, Piikani, and the Kainai, the Tsuut'ina Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda Nations, as well as Métis Nation Region 3, and all people who live and make their homes in Treaty 7 territories. This acknowledgement is significant in the context of today's conversation, as we'll include a discussion around restorative justice. Teachings, which would now be called restorative, have been practiced on this land since time immemorial. And we would have much to learn about justice from listening and learning to the people who have always lived on these territories. I'm Alex Laidlaw, and I'm the chair of the board at Calgary John Howard Society, and I will be your host and moderator this afternoon. Today we will be sharing the results of our 2020 crime survey, and we'll have a following discussion about restorative justice. Calgary John Howard Society's board of directors periodically conducts a survey in the community to gauge Calgarians' attitudes and perspectives about crime, crime prevention, and criminal justice. Our goal in doing so is to ensure we remain accountable to community and understand that our mission, vision, values, and guiding principles remain aligned with and responsive to the views of community. We've done this survey 3 times in 1985, 2009, and now 2020. Our agenda today will start with a presentation by my former board colleague, Dr. Harpreet Aulakh, to share the findings from that survey, and then we'll get into a panel discussion about some of the findings. With that, I'll start with an introduction of Harpreet. Harpreet is an associate professor in criminal justice at the Mount Royal University in Calgary. She holds a PhD in sociology from the University of Saskatoon with a focus on criminology and sociology of law. Harpreet's primary research interests are youth crime, youth justice, gangs, resiliency, intersections of race, ethnicity, and the criminal justice system, indigenization of the justice system, and critical criminology. At MRU, she is a coordinator of the Honors Program, a member of the Scholarship Review Committee, and a board member of the Human Research Ethics Review Board. She also serves on peer review journals. During her time at Mount Royal, Harpreet has been a recipient of the Teaching Excellence Award, and she is actively involved with local Youth Justice Committee and is a former board member here at Calgary John Howard Society. So with that, I will turn it over to Harpreet to share the findings from our 2020 survey.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. As you heard, this is the 3rd periodic survey Calgary John Howard conducted in the past 35 years. And these periodic surveys, as was reflected by Alex, they serve as a mechanism by which Calgary John Howard Society is able to assess the alignment of the agency's objectives and activities with the expectations of the community. So the notion of linkage to ownership follows the Calgary John Howard Society's view of itself as an agency with a vision of creating an informed community active in preventing crime, where community and ownership are the residents of Calgary and its surrounding areas, and by gathering relevant input from the community and in turn reporting back on agency's activities and achievements, Calgary John Howard Society sees itself as an accountable to the Calgary community. The survey was conducted with 2 main objectives. First, to understand the extent to which the Calgarians support the statement of the John Howard Society's values, principles, and objectives. So the survey measured the community's alignment with these values, principles, and further analyzed if there have been any changes in Calgarians' views over these years. The second objective was to understand the Calgarians' perception of crime, justice, community safety, responses to crime, and crime prevention. The intent was to figure out if the agency's emphasis on crime prevention and safer communities through restorative justice and rehabilitation programs aligns with the Calgarians' priorities. A bit about the methodology part. The survey confirmed to the objectives of the previous two surveys. The current survey was conducted with 400 randomly selected Calgarians from Calgary metropolitan region. Trend Research of Edmonton was commissioned to conduct the telephones interviews, which took place over a 12-day period between February 24th and March 6, 2020. Data were analyzed using descriptive statistics. The results of the survey are generalizable to the population living in the Calgary region with a margin of error plus or minus 5%, which means results are accurate 19 times out of 20, which is 95% of the time. A bit about the demographic representation in the survey. Although survey sample population was selected randomly, an equal number of male and female respondents were deliberately selected for the survey. This was consistent with the Calgary's population, in which males and females each accounted for 50% of the population, as per the census data from 2016. The proportion of ethnic groups in the sample population were also consistent with the proportion of Calgary's population across the Indigenous identification and other racial groups. The noted difference in the demographics of the sample population and the Calgary population was in age. The survey sample was overall older, with 1/4 of the respondents from the age group of 55 to 64 years, whereas the Calgary population is overall younger, with 1/3 of the Calgarians in the age group of 25 to 44 years. A higher level of education and income were also reported with survey respondents when compared to the Calgary's population. The first goal was to probe the respondents' support for the statements of the Calgary John Howard Society's values, principles, and objectives. The degree of agreement with the series of these statements was measured by a 5-point Likert scale, ranging from strongly disagree to strongly agree. What you see on the screen is only the representation of the respondents who are displaying a total of strongly agree and agree. The survey was formulated. It asked two versions of these statements, and this is an interesting one, with one version using the word every person as a referent in these statements, and the other version using the words persons who break the law as the alternative. Half of the respondents were given the every person worded survey, and the other half of the respondents were given the offender worded survey. Now, the idea for this was it allowed the difference in the responses of the two versions to reveal the extent to which values people view as appropriate for everyone differ in their application when focus is on the offenders. Now, it's important to note here that the core values that are stated by Calgary John Howard Society in support of its vision and mission only refer to every person, and it is with the clear assumption that this includes offenders. You can see the various statements here and two versions of three of the statements, one with general wording and the second with the wording offender or young person at risk wording. So you can see the alignment with the value statements. It dropped by 20 percentage points when everyone has an intrinsic worth was replaced by people who break the law has intrinsic worth. A similar drop is also visible in the statements regarding the right to be treated with dignity, equity, fairness, and compassion when applied to everyone is changed to offenders. However, it's also noteworthy that there is a drop in agreement for a statement regarding the society's responsibility to provide youth with positive development environment, but the drop is not statistically different, thereby indicating that people are less likely to be critically distinguishing between all youth and youth at risk of breaking the law. Overall, there is a high degree of agreement with the John Howard Society's values. The comparison between the wordings shows that the Calgarians are less willing to assume these values to in fact include offenders. At the same time, as I said, it is important to note that even when the statements focused on offenders, a majority of respondents nonetheless agree that these values apply. With regards to the Calgary John Howard Society's principles of restorative justice and crime prevention through social development, respondents were overall very supportive of them. A high level of agreement is evident for the principle of restorative justice and the idea that addressing societal problems such as poverty, lack of education, unemployment is important for preventing crimes. And also there is a strong support for the provision of programs and services targeting at people who have been or are at risk of being in conflict with the law. So there is overall a great support and agreement, and this has been consistent over the years. Compared to 2 years ago, would you say the crime has increased, remained the same, or decreased in your neighborhood in Calgary and Canada, and looking over time? So as you can see, this question has been consistently asked in all the surveys from the past years, and Calgarians' perceptions of crime trends, they varied markedly by their geographic frame of reference. So when they are thinking about the crime in their neighborhood, the respondents were most often perceived to be unchanging, followed by those who perceived an increase in crime. There are some variations over the years, but consistently, even comparing to the different categorizations, that is what we can see when the neighborhood crime is a frame of reference. When asked to think about the entire city, a significant majority thought crime was on the increase, followed by a much smaller proportion perceiving no change and decrease in crime. And when the frame of geography was increased to the country as a whole, the trend again was for the larger proportion to perceive an increase in crime, although the difference between the perceived increase and no change was not as marked as it was for the perception of crime in the city of Calgary. So these findings are very consistent with the research on attitudes towards crime. Citizens in general tend to see crime in the country as on the rise compared to the crime rates in their communities. And much of this has to their perceptions are impacted by the various factors, and the media plays a big role, and also the conversations in the news and the medias about the crimes happening in the city and the country are reflected, whereas within the community, it is more about them having a first-hand experience and knowledge with interactions with other groups of people in their neighborhoods. Respondents were asked about their preference for prison sentences and alternatives. And these set of questions were basically related to what is the preference for among the respondents pertaining to the restorative justice options, and comparison towards to more punitive approaches or towards alternative approaches. So these perceptions were investigated for both violent offenses and for non-violent offenses. Respondents were asked to list their sentence preference for a first-time offender convicted of a non-violent crime such as breaking and entering. The first preference by half of the respondents was probation and fine, and a quarter preferred only probation, and a prison sentence was a third preference. The same format of questions inquired about respondents' preference for a sentence for a first-time violent offender convicted of assaulting someone. A clear majority listed prison as their option, followed by a fine and probation, and only probation was mentioned by only as a third preference and by only 7.2% of the respondents. The follow-up questions were asked about, from the respondents, inquiring about the respondents' favorability towards a restorative justice option, which was presented as a number of hours of community work or in some other way paying back to the victim for the harm done. An overwhelming majority, as you can see, is of respondents, they prefer the restorative justice option for a non-violent offender. About 86% of the respondents looked at that option, preferred that option, whereas a little more than half, 52% did not prefer a restorative justice option for a first-time violent offender. This is not surprising, as people in general are less likely to approve a non-punitive measure for violent offenders. Now, the findings, they are parallel to the findings from other public perception surveys, where different responses to crime are very much dependent on whether crime is violent or non-violent. What was astonishing, however, was when Calgarians were provided with these restorative justice options, there was a significant jump in preference for these responses when compared to the proportion of people who opted for them way back in 2009 survey. These results, comparative results, are not presented on the slides over here to avoid much complexity, but in 2009, the survey's respondents, 28% of the respondents, they endorsed a restorative justice option for a first-time violent offender. And in 2020 survey, this is a significant jump. 42% of the respondents, they endorsed a restorative justice option for a first-time offender. So that is a huge jump with the similar set of questions and similar set of population in the same geographical location. So to wrap up the findings, major findings of this survey, the results presented in this third periodic community survey by John Howard Society, it overwhelmingly supports the values, principles, and objectives of the society. Calgarians' perceptions are clearly aligning with the agency in supporting offenders and building safer communities. When it comes to the crime trends, the Calgarians their perceptions tend to vary based on the geography, where neighborhood crime rates they are perceived to be mostly unchanging, and city and country crime rates their increases are overestimated. And there, as I said, there are a lot of reasons and factors impacting those. Residents of Calgary in this survey, they offered widespread support for restorative justice, both in principle and when they were inquired to choose between punitive approaches and restorative justice options. There was extensive support for nonviolent offenders, and it is clear that the public support for these alternatives is comparatively less for violent offenders. However, there is a promising trend when compared to the support 11 years ago. So I'm going to end on a positive note that findings suggest that restorative justice practices at sentencing are attracting increased public attention, and Calgarians' support for restorative justice is picking up. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Harpreet. Harpreet's going to come join us momentarily, but we wanted to have a conversation now about restorative justice as a key finding from this survey. Be able to talk about a little bit what that looks like in the day-to-day practice of Calgary John Howard Society's work, as well as how that work benefits and has a role in creating an informed, inclusive community active in preventing crime. So as Harpreet comes to sit beside me, I'll do the formalities of introductions of the others who are with me here today, starting with Deborah Nowakowski. Deborah is the Calgary John Howard Society's Director of Programs and oversees restorative justice programming. She's been with the Calgary John Howard Society for over 20 years and is a trained mediator and restorative justice facilitator. Deborah has over 15 years of experience facilitating RJ processes within the Calgary Community Conferencing Program, the Restorative Action for Transformation Collaboration, and the in-house Calgary John Howard Society's Victim Offender Dialogue. Deborah has been the Calgary John Howard Society's designate on the Alberta Restorative Justice Association Board of Directors for approximately 10 years and is currently serving as Vice Chair. Great to have you here today, Deb.
Thank you, Alex. It's great to be here.
Next is Narda Robillard. Narda is the Restorative Justice Coordinator at Calgary John Howard Society. She is a trained mediator and restorative justice facilitator and works with youth and adults in the Calgary community. Her experience includes working as a facilitator for the Victim Offender Reconciliation Program, the Calgary Community Conferencing Collective, and for the past 5 years, Calgary John Howard Society's in-house restorative solutions to conflict program, which she has helped to develop. Narda has worked with the John Howard Society for the past 16 years and envisions a future for Calgary where restorative processes used as first consideration are an integral part of our justice system. Thanks for joining us today, Narda.
Thank you, Alex. Glad to be here.
Wonderful. And last, I'm going to introduce Brianna Cousins. Brianna's passion for restorative justice began when she learned about it at Mount Royal University while working towards her bachelor's degree in criminal justice. She was actually a student in Harpreet's class. Currently, Brianna works at Calgary John Howard Society as an integration coach. Brianna's primary goal is reintegrating women on federal parole into the community by planning social events, accompanying them on appointments, making dinner together, and helping them develop life skills. Restorative justice is a foundation of Brianna's work as she facilitates difficult conversations between residents in conflict, helps residents identify their triggers, and supports them in taking accountability and expressing empathy. Today, Brianna has been monitoring your questions in the Q&A, so please continue to ask questions there if you haven't already done so about the presentation or the conversation that follows. And I'll turn it over to Brianna after we get through a few questions to be able to bring those questions to our panelists here with us.
Thanks, Alex.
Great, so we'll start with a question for you, Deb. Could you give us some examples of what restorative justice programming and practices look like in the context of Calgary John Howard Society's work, and how long have they run?
Okay. Well, our Restorative Solutions to Conflict program provides non-adversarial approaches to criminal behavior for both youth and adults. And we offer victim offender dialogue, which brings together victims and offenders and their supporters to address the harmful impacts of criminal behavior. And with the focus on victim needs, offender responsibility, accountability, and the reparation of harm caused. Okay. The second program we offer is the crime impact sessions, and that's a transformative justice model, which is a one-on-one program that provides a reflective dialogue to a person who's been charged with an offense to identify the underlying causes of their criminal behavior, their triggers, and the program helps them develop strategies to lead a crime-free life. The interesting part of our programming is there's no wrong entry point. We work with people who are on diversion. We work in parallel with the court system, so pre-sentence, and then we work post-sentence on probation conditions. And we've been offering these programs since 1985, so pretty close to 40 years.
It's amazing.
Mm-hmm.
And how often does Calgary John Howard Society do this work? What are the referrals like? How much of this work is happening?
Oh my goodness, the referrals are up over 100% than they were last year. When did it happen? There's a restorative justice pilot project that began in the end of March 2022, and it brought together people at the Crown, lawyers, the judiciary, and they formed a restorative justice pilot project and to work in the courts. And the recommendation is that all matters that are appropriate for a restorative intervention be sought out to make a referral to a restorative intervention. And since that time, our referrals are increasing, on the increase.
Wow.
Yeah,
that's great.
It's very exciting.
Yeah, that's really exciting
It
to
is.
see that growth is happening and that the demand for these alternatives is there.
Exactly.
My next question is for you, Narda. For those of us who may be a little bit less familiar, what are some of the key differences between a restorative process and typical punitive measures that we might be more familiar with?
Well, I like that you said the word punitive, because our traditional justice system is very much based on crime and punishment. So who committed the crime, what kind of punishment do they deserve, and how should that punishment be determined? It's not really based on what's going to be effective crime responses to crime in the way that it's not relationship based. So restorative justice asks different questions. They ask who was harmed, what needs to happen to repair that harm, what are the victim's needs and what can help with the offender as well to change their behavior, and then and who should be involved. So often with restorative justice, there are multiple people involved, community members, the person who caused the harm, the person who was harmed, as well as their supporters, all getting together and talking things through and coming to some sort of agreement that they're all actively involved in. So it allows for that reparation of harm in a very meaningful and relationship-based way.
Great, thanks so much, Narda. You mentioned kind of what do victims need. You jumped to another question, which was acknowledging the experience of every victim is different. How do those who have been harmed by crime typically feel about participating in a restorative justice process?
Well, initially victims might be a little reluctant because they're not understanding what restorative justice is about and what the opportunities could be for them. But once we meet with a victim and we get to hear their experience, it can be very validating for them to be able to express all the impacts of how they were harmed and the different nuances of maybe they were out financially or emotionally they were upset by what happened. Often what happens first is a no contact order by the Crown and the defense so that they cannot have contact with the person who harmed them, and so they're not able to have questions answered, like why did you pick my house if you broke into it? You know, what did you take? What did you do to my dog who, when I came home, was locked up in my room? Like, there's so many questions that people might have when they've been impacted by a criminal offense, and there's so much satisfaction in being able to have those questions answered, which can only be answered by the person who actually committed the offense. As well, just the empowerment of being part of the process, an active part in responding to crime where victims don't get that opportunity in traditional court. They may be able to make a victim impact statement, but they're never able to stand up and just talk about how they feel, about how they were affected, or be a part of the solution. So restorative justice allows victims to be part of that process. So it can be very validating and empowering. It can make them feel safer because they get to actually talk to the person who caused the harm. And in that way, it makes them feel safe that they're not going to be targeted again, or that they have a general understanding of actually what happened. It can be very, very healing, Alex, for victims.
That sounds really powerful to understand that victims get to participate and be listened to in a different way.
Exactly.
So I'm going to ask one final question of Harpreet before I turn it over to Brianna to ask some questions from the audience. So Harpreet, I know this is beyond the scope of the survey, but if you had to speculate, what would you guess is the cause of community interest in restorative justice growing? What is it about restorative justice or recent trends in society that has made it that this is something that people are more open to?
Yeah, no, that's a good point, and we can go back to the research that has been done to look at it. And some of the things that Narda mentioned about the significance, bringing the victims into the picture, it is one of the reasons. And I think it is more about the awareness about restorative justice, right? People are acknowledging that there are options to punitive measures, and the work that the community organizations engaged with restorative justice are making their presence felt, and the programs that are described are happening with Calgary John Howard Society and other organizations across the justice system. They are a validation that community is recognizing those things. And I think to Narda's point about the psychological research clearly indicates that people give more value when it comes to satisfaction with the individualized justice, right? So the victims getting satisfaction that my voice was heard, and the answers to the questions why I was picked, why I was the target, right? Those kind of things really have an impact. And I think the experimental research indicates that the public is more likely to choose alternatives to imprisonment or punitive measures when the restorative options are on the table, right? Mm-hmm. And that has quite a bit of impact, that the public is attracted to those options because, and the ability to understand, to make the connection to the crime in their communities, having a voice in the decision making that is happening, in the events that are happening in their neighborhoods, in their communities, that gives empowerment to the community members. The other important thing is that all the attention given to the punitive measures And it's a very costly affair to run prisons and the justice system.
Yes.
And when there is a lack of involvement by the public, then they seem that, well, is there enough happening? But the things that are happening at the community level and their engagement in those programs, it gives them validation. Right. And when we see that, and when we heard, we looked at findings that the perception is the crime rates in the Calgary as a city or at the national level, their perception is increasing, even if it's an overestimation of the actual crime rates. But then they start questioning, is the punitive approach the right approach when other options are available? And also it has to do with more research being done on the effectiveness of these of restorative justice programs and the satisfaction level of satisfaction that comes from all the parties involved.
That's great to hear. So this might be somewhat of an oversimplification, but it sounds like that people are growing, the restorative justice is growing in interest because people are understanding that it works, that they're seeing that the outcomes for community can be better than the alternatives or than that's been kind of common.
Yeah, and it has to do more about understanding how it works, right? It's not just putting the people in the prison. That's the most common understanding that we think that that is going to work, but how this process works.
Great. Well, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brianna, who can share some questions from the audience for our panelists.
Amazing. I actually have another question for Harpreet. We have a past board member here who led the work on the 2009 survey, and they're curious to know if the 2020 survey replicated the questions about community support for halfway houses and the questions about support for Calgary John Howard Society programs for incarcerated persons.
Yes, and we did the 2020 survey was very much a replication of the 2009 survey, and we asked those questions, but we did not present those findings in the presentation today because of the limitations of the time, and we wanted to highlight on the restorative justice. So most of those findings will be available on a report about the community's great support for the programs and all the different options that offenders go support for halfway houses, community services, and those kind of programs. So those findings will be available on our John Howard Society's website in the near future, pretty soon.
Perfect, thank you. We have a question here. I'm wondering if Narda, maybe you could follow up with this one. Someone asked, how does a restorative justice approach benefit the offender? I know we talked about the victims, but what about that other side?
Well, when we work with people who've been involved in criminal offenses, we can start to understand the root causes of their actions. So that could be mental health issues, it could be addictions, it could be poverty, it could be just lack of opportunity a lot of the time. So that allows us that opportunity to help understand, number one, the reason that the crime was committed, and to address some of those issues of trying to help this person move forward in a positive way. But also there's a sense of guilt and shame often involved with people who are involved in criminal offenses. Most people are not proud of sometimes the worst day of their life. So by allowing them to try to move past that guilt and shame to doing something more positive about it, and helping them understand that people do make mistakes, but it's about how we deal with those mistakes. How do we move forward? How do we repair that harm? And supporting them through that process can be so life-changing for these people that would never otherwise be listened to in a respectful way or be non-judged when they get to tell their story to us, and just all the support that surrounds this agency that we can help people with, as well as other agencies in the community. They're doing wonderful work that we're also connected to. So our hope is to wrap around supports around people that are involved in criminal offenses and helping them move forward and to feel better about themselves in the process.
Thanks, I love that answer. That was fantastic. It looks like we have a few questions about what types of crimes that are better handled with restorative justice approaches. Are there any types of offensive that a restorative justice approach is appropriate for? Deb, maybe you want to take that one?
Well, and you know what, Brianna, that's one of the myths out there is that restorative justice is good for, diversionary offenses or, low impact. But really research shows that restorative justice processes are good for any severity of offense. There is, with a caveat, there's a hesitation right now to use a restorative justice approach with sexual offenses. So there's some research that's happening. I'm sure you're aware of that, Harpreet. So the caveat I would put out there is that if people can take responsibility for their actions, and if they're genuine and they want to meet with that person, and I think we can explore those things and look to bring them together if everyone involved is interested. Yeah, as it's a voluntary process.
For sure.
And Brianna, I'd like to just add to that too. It also has to do with the victim's capacity and willingness as well. So I think that we should definitely explore restorative justice in any type of an instance. We have to give enough credit to the victim also to understand what is right for them. And I think sometimes we want to protect victims and say, oh, they couldn't handle that, or the offender can't handle this. But I think we have to give people credit and start from a view of them being capable, not being not capable.
Sure.
I would like to jump in and just something that I remember from a conversation we'd had previously is that there can be benefit to the offender of going through a process even if the victim isn't willing to participate, that even just writing a letter that might not even be sent could have some kind of benefit in terms of taking that step of ownership of what had occurred. Could you speak a little bit to that, maybe what this might look like in cases where there might not even be victim participation, but still some kind of restorative process happening?
Yeah, so if it's not appropriate to move forward in involving a victim, which can happen, sometimes it would be us relaying information from the victim to the person who committed the crime, so there doesn't have to be any direct contact. Sometimes the person who caused the harm can write an apology letter. We would then ask the victim if they're willing to accept that apology letter. But just the process of either writing an apology or going through a reflective dialogue helps them think about who was harmed. In what way were they harmed? How did this impact them? How did this impact me? What does this mean for me moving forward in my life? How did it affect my family and everybody that cares for me? So just being able to be supported in that process can be very cathartic for somebody who's committed an offense, as well as safer for society, for people that are actually stopping to think through their actions before they continue with harmful behavior.
Amazing. I have another question for Harpreet. This one is, how do attitudes towards restorative justice in Calgary compare to views elsewhere? Is it a growing global trend? Can you speak more to that?
Yeah, definitely. It is a growing phenomenon, not just in Canada. There had been efforts to gauge the public's opinion and perceptions have been taken at the national level, even by the Department of Justice engaged into a big survey research and got the interest, and public has been fully supported. There has been research that is taking quite a bit of vibrancy in England, in Europe, Germany, and Netherlands, and New Zealand has been doing this. They're way ahead for us, right? And there is more support for family conferencing when tackling with young people, and then the United States. Definitely it's seen as a growing justice and more awareness pertaining to this, and that is their reasoning behind this growing support for restorative justice. People are becoming more aware about what it entails. It's not, I think mentioned about Deb mentioned about the myth about it. It is more of a lenient approach, right? A slap on the wrist. It is not that. People are really acknowledging the deeper principles of harm done and what my actions have caused, right? So it is not just from the victim perspective, as earlier question and response was that, but it is also about the offender. Did I really intend to do this much harm? I think people are realizing that. Mm-hmm. So it is a very global phenomenon about the support, and it was really astonishing to see that happening in Calgary as well.
That's great to hear.
Can I just add something to that? It takes a huge amount of courage for someone to sit across from a person that they've harmed, to take responsibility, talk about what they've done in detail, and then hear how they've impacted them. And it just takes a lot of courage to be able to do that. And that's so empowering for both the victim and offender.
Yeah, and just to add that, my work has been with young people engaging in crimes like breaking and entering. I came across with this one young person who had been part of gang associations and stuff like that, and he engaged in quite a bit of breaking and entering. So it was basically one night of spree of breaking and entering into the neighborhood and a couple of blocks. And when he was asked to sit in a community conference, and he said, one of the comments, he said, you should be able to listen sitting there for 8 hours, right? The impact that it caused to the victims, right? And things like now they only have one vehicle to go to the car to work and drop the kids at school. And when I listened to those things, it said, well, a teenager who didn't care about that stuff is getting the real issues. What are the real impact that actions have caused?
Yeah. And I facilitated a circle once where they brought a 5-year-old boy into the circle, and their house had been broken into, and the person had gone in through his bedroom window. And what they learned sitting in that circle was that that young boy wasn't able to sleep in his room anymore and had not been able to since that happened. And, part of the process is listening to that impact, but then addressing it as well, coming back with a way to repair the harm. And the person I was working with, they came back and they offered a nightlight to this young boy because they couldn't believe that they'd impacted them like that. And what he said was, here's a nightlight. I would like you to put that in your room and just know when you see that, you are safe and I won't be coming back. And then final comments, we came around, I have goosebumps, sorry. Final comments came around, the little boy was asleep in the circle. It was just so impactful.
It's amazing, I love that story. And just kind of to go more in depth into that, what are the panelists' thoughts on that punitive measures, or that restorative justice rather, is the easier way out?
Ooh. Well, we've seen people go through restorative justice. It can be nerve-wracking for them. One young person expressed it as like it felt like going into the gauntlet with having all these people ready that they had to face and talk about. I worked with a young person who had been in jail in and out most of his life, and we talked about what would it be like if you had a restorative process with somebody that you harmed. He says, oh no, I could never do that. I'd rather spend more time here in jail. So it shows you that it does, like Deb said, it takes a lot of courage. Of course, he didn't understand what it would be like to be in the process, and we're still talking about these things, but it's not easy work. And the people that have to apologize or that are there to apologize, it's very difficult to do. And they must know that the victim might not accept their apology. They're under no obligation to accept their apology while they're in that circle. So it takes a lot of courage to go in there and say, I'm so sorry. I had no idea I caused you this amount of harm, and then be ready and willing to accept the fact that they might not accept their apology. So how difficult is that, right? And that's why it's so impactful when it can happen, and it does happen. It's just like magic. It's amazing the impact it can have. We've seen people hugging at the end of these things, a person who was harmed hugging the person who harmed them, because they now understand why they did what they did, and maybe they had a lot of misfortune in their lives, and things just kind of rolled out that way in their life. But there's so much to understand just by having dialogue. It's common sense to sort problems out by talking about them, and the court process does not allow that to happen.
That's really impactful. Thanks for sharing that. We have a question from Emily asking, at what point in this process is restorative justice suggested? Do you work with CPS at all, or what does that look like?
The police have the capacity to refer to programs. They don't even have to give a formal warning or lay a charge. So that's one of the things that they're able to do. So they can, and they do, refer youth to programs pre-charge. Once a charge is laid, however, it's in the Crown Prosecutor's hands whether that charge is going to stick and if that young person is going to be referred to a restorative process if it goes through that court process. So the police can be involved. Resource officers can send us referrals, which they have done in the past, school resource officers, and they can also send it pre-charge prior to going to court if they so wish to do so. But if the charge is laid, then it's basically in the Crown Prosecutor's hands after that.
We have another question. Given the offender demographics, how much does Calgary John Howard Society restorative initiatives draw on Indigenous approaches to restorative justice?
I'll let you answer that one too.
Regardless of a person's culture, whether they're Indigenous or from any other culture, we would want to be able to, number one, understand as much as we can about their culture and what would be respectful for them, what would be comfortable for them, what maybe some of their ceremonial processes might be, and try to address it by engaging elders or others in their community that they feel comfortable with. So anybody that comes into a circle would be able to bring supporters with them, and that might include elders. It might include somebody else from their church or somebody else from their community. So regardless of their culture, we always keep that in mind, and we want it to be a respectful process and engage with all people in the circle in a respectful way that they all agree upon.
So on that note, are there any changes that you would make when facilitating like an adult process versus a youth process? Would those look the same?
Well, with youth, we definitely engage parents when it comes to youth. Anybody that's under 18, we would want to inform parents and have them actively involved in the process. Anybody that's 18 or over can choose who they want to be there, so they might not want a parent involved. They might want their brother or sister or a best friend or somebody else to be there for them. So I guess the approach is kind of the same, except for who's in the circle might change a little bit or what their role might be in that circle. When we have a youth in the circle, we want to have parents there so they can see their youth who might have caused harm doing something good and taking responsibility and being able to speak to their assets so that the person sitting across from them who was harmed doesn't just see them for that person in that moment in time. So it's really important that parents play a role. And then when the youth goes home, of course, they have the support and the understanding of their parents for the great work that they just finished doing and being able to commend them for that and feel proud of them for that. So it's appropriate for anybody, but in a youth, yeah, a parent role might be a little bit different.
I have another question, maybe Harpreet, you can answer this. Do you have a sense if the work that is happening in Canada regarding reconciliation is impacting how the public views restorative justice?
Yeah, definitely. The fact that some of the principles of restorative justice have some kind of a similar grounds with the Indigenous justice, and the move towards reconciliation and bringing in more indigenization of the more different programs within the justice system has a contribution to play with the more support and more curiosity to learn about this process, right? So yeah.
Perfect.
And also the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's National Inquiry Calls to Justice. There is more awareness pertaining to that.
So how can someone get involved with a restorative process? Is there a referral process?
Yes, there's we have yes, definitely. We have an email address for people that can access the referral forms and then email it in. So the referral forms are on our website.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Is there anything that people can do to support restorative justice in the community?
You know what I would encourage people to do is to talk about it.
And
I'm really excited that these conversations are starting to have, because I have to be honest, when I was facilitating processes and people would ask me what I did for a living, and I said, I'm a restorative justice facilitator, and they go, what's that? And the only people who knew what it was, they'd either been a victim or an offender. So these conversations and the research that was done and the increase in Calgary's knowledge and willingness to support restorative justice is beyond exciting for me.
Yeah.
And I'd like to add to that too, that, you know, people talk about the justice system and they're very frustrated. They're frustrated with delays. They're frustrated with not being able to stand up in court and say what they feel. They're frustrated with you know, consequences, whether it be if somebody gets a probation order, how meaningful is that? They check in with a probation officer once a month or once every 2 weeks. And I mean, probation officers in the city can be very caring and, you know, impactful in their own way in the work that they do with clients. But most people don't understand that there's another way to do things as well that can be so impactful and so meaningful. So I'm with Deb. I'm so excited about your research, Harpreet, and about everything that's happening with the support for restorative justice in Calgary, because it's so long overdue. And we've been around for so long, but so many people still don't understand it. So our hope is that we just have more and more people understand what restorative justice is, and that it is an integral part of our justice system. It doesn't have to be separate from, right? It's an important part of people being held accountable in a meaningful way.
Yeah, and that people ask for an opportunity to be part of it. You know, if they've been harmed by someone, or if they've harmed someone, you know, ask. I mean, Narda, you have people who are actually asking to do that. They go back to court and say, I want to take part in this process. That's right. And I think that's hugely impactful.
I think that if you understand the group psychology, and every group as a community wants to feel safe, and they will be ready to do anything that involves making their community safer. I think, and this is I think a perfect opportunity where we are having discussions about diversification of funding of the justice system, where we are talking about reconciliation, indigenization, and decolonization. We are having discussions about the growing appetite, right? So it is a great opportunity for agencies like Calgary John Howard Society and other organizations in the community to grab onto this opportunity, because at the end of the day, public opinion has a strong vote, and that's where you can take the public to the politicians who are making our lawmakers to really be thinking about it. So I think the governments are also looking for cost-effective solutions, and I think this is an area that has been put in left ignored for quite some time, and this is a perfect time and space to have these conversations, more conversations like this to happen.
That reminds me of the launch of the pilot project, where there was a judge there that was talking about, he was engaged in these circles himself, and he says, you know, he said, I sat there for 7 hours in this circle. He said, but compare that to sending this person to prison for 2 years at $100,000 a year for prison. So look how much money our society just saved by helping this person take accountability and having his community accept him back into the community, and in moving forward in a powerful and healing way for everybody at stake. And it makes the community safer in a way that doesn't cost $200,000.
Yeah, and also the restorative justice another way to let the community know that there is not just the individual factors that impact the criminal behavior, it's the community factors as well, and those social factors. And the community needs to take the responsibility at some point of those factors as well. And this is a place for them to be engaged.
That's a good point.
Very good point. All I would want to add is that, you know, restorative justice is about repairing relationships, but in the words of Howard Zerr, the grandfather of restorative justice, a byproduct is lower recidivism rates. So we're addressing an issue now and in the future.
And the research that we were looking at the other day showed there's about a 35% reduction in recidivism for those that have participated in restorative justice. So it's not the purpose of restorative justice, but it is a byproduct of. But that's a huge reduction in recidivism rates.
What about for individuals experiencing mental health or addiction? How does that impact this process?
Well, part of us meeting with the person who caused the harm, the offender, is to assess their capacity. So And we do that very carefully. And so we might have multiple meetings with somebody to see, are they able to have this respectful conversation with somebody who they harmed? Are they going to be able to sit there for this long? Maybe we have to adjust the process so that it's not so long, or it's in more than one meeting. There's ways of adjusting for some things. In other ways, maybe we'll say, well, you know, this person hasn't been able to be sober long enough to see if they could go through this and be sober. So maybe they need treatment first, and then we can revisit it afterwards. So there's all kinds of ways that we can look at these processes as when is the right time. So maybe it's not that it's off the table, maybe it's that we just have to wait until they're ready.
I'm a firm believer that there's never a wrong time for restorative justice intervention.
All right, well, it looks like we're running out of time. I want to thank everybody for their questions. I'll ask one more before we wrap this up. Unfortunately, we couldn't get to all of them. My last question, therefore, is going to be, is there ongoing discussions or counseling after these circle processes that brings these groups together? What happens after?
Well, obviously, you know, and it depends on. Okay, I'll give you an example. So we had a young person who met with, he was a new immigrant to Canada, and he was working at a Mac store, and he was targeted as and hit by an egg. And so the youth were charged with assault with a weapon. And we brought them together. They had their conversation. What they found out from this man was that he came to Canada to have a safe life. He wanted safety and community. And those boys, when they heard this, they were hugely impacted by that. And part of their agreement was to meet with him. They would go for coffee. They would meet with him on a regular basis. They would come to the store and introduce their friends and their girlfriends to build that relationship. So a lot of times, there's no short answer to this, I'm sorry, but a lot of times it's what is needed, what it's the outcome of what happens in the circle, what the agreement items are, and sometimes it's what NARDA and the person discuss when they're preparing to come together with the person that they harmed.
And it might be a conversation with, let's say the referral comes from Defence or Crown, it might be a conversation with Crown as to what do they require for follow-up. So we always want to follow up later to see how their experience was for them. If it was meaningful, we do that with the victims and with the offenders with a value-based survey, but it might be further follow-up depending on what is required.
Amazing.
And maybe we've connected them with some resources and we want to follow up and see how did that go for you.
What a beautiful way to wrap this up. I'll pass it over to Alex.
Yeah, thanks so much, everyone. Thanks, Brianna, Deb, Narda, Harpreet, for all of your wonderful insights. I could have sat here and listened to this conversation for another hour, and I know we had lots of questions we didn't get to online. So hopefully we have a chance to maybe do this again, or if you'd like to continue the conversation and ask some questions of our panelists, when I'm done speaking, we'll pop a screen up that has an email address that you can reach out to be able to, it's at info@cjhs.ca, info@cjhs.ca. Is how you can get in touch with us to be able to ask any questions that we weren't able to get to today, or if you'd like to continue the conversation about how restorative justice practices might be able to be more widespread. It was really exciting to hear this finding in the crime survey, to have this interest in restorative justice that's so prominent from the community, and also to hear from those who do this work day to day how much more opportunity there is for us to be able to see this as an alternative to a system that sometimes isn't working to really address that root cause or address that root harm. So I'm excited to continue the conversation from here and hope today is just the starting point of many great conversations for us to be able to continue about restorative justice and what that looks like here in Calgary. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you, Alex.
Thank you.